Hello, welcome back to my ESG exam channel. I'm the three key concepts E, S, and G. In the past two episodes, we talked about E, and that's environments. So in this episode, which for chapter 4, we'll talk about social. But unlike what we had in the past, before I proceed to chapter 4, let's recap the key concept that we learned in last episode. So let's begin. Chapter 4 is relatively short, although there are still quite a few learning outcomes, but then I'll say that the amount of material that you probably need to remember for exam is actually a lot less. So the first learning outcome is to explain the systemic relationship activities between business activities and a number of social issues. I'll say that a lot of these points are kind of common sense, but then, well, I'll just maybe highlight certain impacts anyway. Like the globalization, they'll include a few things like offshoring. So they'll lead to the disappearing industries like textiles in Western countries due to relocation to low-wage countries like a lot of countries in Asia. And dependencies like IT products, for example, say maybe the semiconductor chips, the manufacturing of those are dominated by US and Asian companies, and then maybe not so much in Europe. Automation AI, well, they can well displace workers whose skills are replaced. Inequality in wealth creation, and an impact is that it may reduce educational opportunities and social mobility. And another kind of related issue is that some companies may become aggressive in tax optimization, like say domiciled operations in low tax countries or tax havens. Digital disruption, social media, and access to electronic devices. They may affect the value proposition of existing goods and services and challenge existing business models. For example, say the way of distribution may be very different. For example, a lot of say distribution or sales in the past could be from say brick and mortar shops or maybe face-to-face sales agents, but then a lot of these activities are done online. It's also possible that like so big data you stored by lots of these say social media companies. They may use and sell such data in more extreme or socially unacceptable ways. Changes to work, leisure time, education. And in developed countries, because automation and part-time employment, the average working hour of employee is often less than in the past. But then, well, on the other hand, because given modern technologies, employees can be connected to the company maybe 24 hours a day. So this kind of constant connection to work will build a so-called work-life boundary because a lot of things may be done outside the office. Changes to individual rights and responsibilities and family structures. Like say, for example, say women are now more financially independent. So that means that there's less dependence on family structure for financial security. And on the other hand, like say still inequality between men and women. For example, say job opportunities or maybe wages. Aging population. Obviously, with fewer people working, and then more people on retirement and receiving pension, they have an adverse impact on tax revenues and challenges pension systems. And then older people have higher savings but spend less on consumer goods, but then they have much higher demand for health care. So that means that the mix of spending or consumption pattern will change as the population ages. urbanization. Due to high cost of, as a result of urbanization, local working class may be priced out. There may also be so-called urban heat islands, where urban areas produce and retain heat. And due to urbanization, there may be high mortality from diseases like cancer, heart disease. Say as well, a lot of city dwellers have adopted to maybe less healthy living practices or habits. And dwellers in slums may be in poor health. Religion. Like I said, Christians may avoid investing in companies inconsistent with Christian values. But in Muslims, it's kind of more obvious. Muslims may well avoid investing in companies inconsistent with Sharia or maybe Islamic principles, like say alcohol, pornography, gambling, pork, and interest-paying investments. Yeah, because in Islam, receiving interest is prohibited. Learning outcome number 2 is to assess key major trends influencing social changes in terms of potential impact on companies and their social practices. In a few things. Well, I'll say that these points are also kind of common sense, but I will highlight them anyway. Climate change transition risks may cause job losses. I say in terms of transition risks, say if like I say again, like the example is electric cars. If companies stop making thermal engine cars and change to electric cars instead, then a lot of the workers in the thermal engine supply chain will lose their jobs. Water scarcity. In order to treat water, it can be capital intensive and costly. And water scarcity and desertification may create mass migration, as people need to go to places with water. Loss or degradation of natural resources and ecosystem services that may cause stakeholder opposition, social unrest, and or migration. Like the third learning outcome, I'll say that in this part, the most important thing upfront is to identify which social factors are internal and which social factors are external. So internal ones, you include human capital and development, working conditions, health and safety, human rights, employment standards and labor rights, including freedom of association and employee relations, forced labor, and living wage. The external ones will include stakeholder opposition and controversial sourcing, product liability and consumer protection, social opportunities, animal welfare, and antimicrobial resistance. So, very roughly speaking, internal ones are those internal to a company or business, and the external ones are those outside the company. For example, say customers or other stakeholders. And then for the rest of this learning outcome, I think in terms of passing the exam, one does need to focus on the major policy initiatives arising from these social concepts. So the first one will be the work under working conditions, health and safety. So the most important one I think to remember is the so-called Bangladesh Accord. It's an accord between over 175 brands after the so-called Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. Well, that's the collapse of the building which killed a lot of workers inside the building. The commitment is to higher fire and health and safety standards in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, well, so you may notice that it has become a major manufacturer of goods like say textiles and clothes. Human rights. Well, there are a number of international initiatives on human rights. The first one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then the next one is the so-called UNGP, United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It outlines how countries and businesses should implement a framework and provide access to remedy for victims of business-related abuses. The third one are the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which is a set of government-backed recommendations on responsible business conduct. The fourth one is the so-called Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, HRP. It is collaboration led by investors and civil society organizations dedicated to creating the first open public benchmark of corporate human rights performance. And HRP provides a comparative snapshot year on year of the largest companies on their human rights approach and how they respond to serious allegations. And then we have the international labor standards. Under these standards, workers are to obtain decent and productive work with freedom, equity, security, and dignity. And the standards are included in the 8 fundamental conventions of the International Labour Organization, which are freedom of association, protection of the right to organize and collective bargaining, forced labor, abolition of forced labor, minimum age, worst forms of child labor, equal remuneration, and discrimination. Stakeholder opposition and controversial sourcing. Under this, companies should focus on local communities and recognize how they can be involved in stakeholder engagement processes to understand their needs and concerns and how these can be addressed. And one important principle under this is the so-called free, prior, informed consent. That means that a company that plans to develop on ancestral land or use resources of a territory owned by indigenous people should establish this so-called FPIC. So, what's meant by FP and I? F is free, which means no manipulation or coercion of the indigenous people. Prior, consent has to be sought sufficiently in advance of any activities that may affect the indigenous people. Informed, relevant indigenous people should receive satisfactory information on the key points of the project that's going to affect them. Animal welfare and antimicrobial resistance. One thing to highlight is that, well, given intensive farming practices, apart from the impact on the animals, they may also harm humans. For example, the increased antimicrobial resistance against antibiotics, etc., may make standard treatments increasingly ineffective. So that gives rise to a principle called Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return, or FAIR, which focuses on the increased prevalence of antimicrobial resistance due to intensive farming practices and poor antibiotic stewardship. Right, so getting to the end of this chapter. Outcome number 4 and 5, I'll say there may not be a lot of examinable material in relation to these learning outcomes. So maybe just very briefly, first we need to understand that the impact from social issues are country, sector, and company specific. And then in terms of country specific factors, there will mainly be due to regulation, like say EU taxonomy, which we encountered several times in the past, the UK Modern Slavery Act, which requires medium large size companies to provide annual slavery and human trafficking statement. Okay, last one. Apply material social factors. Again, materiality of social factors is sector specific. That means that different sectors may have suffer different impact in terms of materiality of different social factors. One thing just to highlight is that recent EU and UK regulation is asking for double materiality reporting. Well, I hope you still remember what's meant by double materiality. That means that, well, we just cannot just consider the financial impact of ESG factors company, but also consider the impact of that company to the environment. And then, well, there are guidelines on how to do materiality assessment, so like the OECD due diligence guideline for responsible business conduct, and also UN guiding principles on business and human rights, UNGP, that we counted a bit earlier. Thank you.